Okay, so this afternoon's session is about thinking about how migration helps us to address territorial inequalities. I'm just going to give a brief presentation to join this, and then I'm going to step out, and Apostolos is going to chair this next panel along with Juicy and along with Lewis, who is on his way here from another meeting, so hopefully we'll be here by the time I finish this presentation, and Bettina, who is joining us online. And a number of things here I think do pick up on some of the issues already raised in the discussions this morning, where migration has come up a few times, but we're going to be focusing in that on that more in terms of what how migration can help us to think about territorial inequalities. And this is one of the work packages within IMAJINE, and this is just a brief overview of what is done there. And there was a combination again of different types of data. The research particularly focused on these regions across, what is that, 5 countries, I think, if I'm counting correctly. And within specific case study regions, case study districts, there was a decision to focus on particular groups of migrants, which gives them range of experiences. It, to some degree, helps to pull out some of these relations and flows we talked about earlier between regions. We also talked to residents first. That gives you kind of a broad overview. And in total, there were about 350 interviews done in these case study regions. In addition to this, as part of the online survey we did for IMAJINE, there was a set of questions in there on migration and migration decision making and experiences, which we ran in 5 of those countries, in Greece, in the Netherlands. Actually, was it not in Greece? Sorry, it wasn't in Greece. Actually, it was just in Poland, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, and the UK, which gave us 2,300 responses there. And then this analysis also worked with some of the statistical measures and some of the data we produced in early work packages, plus other external data. So again, I'm just going to pull out a few headline findings from this. The first is that inequalities between regions are a driver of migration. There's nothing ground-shakingly new about that finding, but we have evidence which begins to support that a bit more. So we look, for example, this is from the survey. We asked about prospects that people are obviously still in those countries of future migration and what might be reasons for migrating. And what I think really stands out here is a contrast between Poland and Romania on the one hand and the Netherlands and the UK on the other hand. And the sense that actually economic factors and overcoming economic inequality between regions in terms of better employment opportunities, in terms of higher wages, is a far more significant factor behind potential migration in Poland and Romania than it is in the Netherlands and the UK. Netherlands and the UK, lifestyle issues were more likely to be the significant drivers for potential migration in the future. And some of those rationales around better employment opportunities and so on were key linked then to perceptions about the relative position of those home regions. And so when we asked about how difficult they felt it was to find employment in their region, there's again a contrast that comes up here between regions, particularly Poland and Romania, were very high rates, between a third and a half respondents talked about finding a job being very difficult. We asked about finding a suitable job and qualification. And again, those regions perhaps standing out more being particular compared to regions in the Netherlands and the UK. So there's some evidence there about inequalities being drivers of migration. Second, we also picked up through some of the qualitative interviews. Individual migrants take advantage of these disparities, improving their relative position, not only in terms of employment opportunities, but also disparities in relative costs of living, and particularly this role of own property. So this is one thing, for example, an example of this is what we picked up in Wales, where we're picking up migration to Wales and other parts of the UK, and especially London, which was about taking advantage of differential house prices. So that you could people can move out of a more expensive location, particularly if they were owning property, they're selling that up, buying larger, better quality housing at a cheaper price, and therefore getting a better relative standard of living or a better relative status by moving region. But also we are picking up there's a knock-on effect of that this has an effect on inflated house prices in those destination regions and potentially excluding lower income residents in those destination regions, with potentially a kind of consequential displacement into other places again. So knock-on effect of change through that. Thirdly, migration can be an informal mechanism for redistribution between regions. And again, we know this happens, but it's useful actually thinking about this in the context of thinking about policies to address territorial inequality and thinking about social justice. Is that we've talked again earlier today in panels about the importance of those relations and flows between regions, and they're often not being visible. And this is again one we don't necessarily think about. It's actually an informal strategy here of redistribution of migrant workers in higher wage economies, adding to flows of higher income back into lower wage regions, and that in a sense being an informal channel of redistribution of wealth. Investment going into property and businesses in home regions, but also return migrants taking that enhanced skills, increasing human capital in those regions. But a caveat about regions needing to be equipped with the capacity to take advantage of those inputs. Otherwise, what you potentially get is just a cycle of repeat migration and actually relatively limited returns coming to those home regions. So the flip side of that is actually that disparity between regions may be intensified by out-migration and depopulation. So that where we have got regions with long-term depopulation, that continuing out-migration potentially intensifies that depopulation and therefore intensifies and accentuates those inequalities between those regions and other regions which are more stable in terms of population. The consequence of that can be weakening of the tax revenue base in those regions. That leads to weakening of support for public services. There is reduced custom potentially for private sector shops and services. There's a reduction in the human capital available to support business development. So you get this kind of intensifying cycling going on. It also potentially reinforces the stigmatization of those regions as being places which no one wants to live, which are left behind. And that perception, and that again feeds back into this idea of spatial injustice, that those regions are seen as left behind. In other words, they're seen as being victims of spatial injustice. Again, a slight comment about what we do have also picked up in some of the IMAJINE research is positions where labour gaps created by out-migration have to some degree been filled by new migrants, often from outside the EU. We had this in Poland, for example, Ukrainian migrants into Poland, but actually it wasn't a precise like-for-like replacement. And although you may have had some kind of compensation or balancing at the regional scale, we've probed into what was happening at a local level. Now, those new migrants were not necessarily going into exactly the same communities which other migrants have left. So you get potentially a widening of within region spatial inequalities and the consequence of that. Fourthly, then, the uneven geography of migration destinations, including the uneven geography of refugee settlement, can also fuel perceptions of spatial injustice. And here we know that those patterns of migration, on the one hand, by migrant workers, and also patterns of refugee settlement, tend to be spatially concentrated in the regions. In some cases, that's determined by geographical location. So again, we pick that up in our research, particularly in terms of refugee settlement in parts of Greece. It's very evident at the moment in terms of areas of Poland, for example, in terms of now large influxes of refugees from Ukraine. But you also see it to some extent in terms of that geography being shaped by the economic structure of the region, of having a high demand, for example, for migrant labour, creating those concentrations. And if you get relatively substantial or rapid increases in migrant and refugee numbers in those places, then that can increase pressures on public services, and housing and labour markets. And those pressures may be especially felt in regions which are already structurally disadvantaged to some degree, and therefore potentially have less capacity to adjust. So again, that has potentially intensifies these inequalities. And certainly we know this can contribute to perceptions of spatial injustice. There are discourses potentially of regions feeling they have taken an unfair share of the burden of hosting, particularly refugees. And I think that in turn can be exploited by xenophobic political movements, amplifying polarization, stigmatization, and social inequalities in those regions. And actually finally on that last point, what we also know, we documented that if you do, unfortunately, you don't see discrimination against migrants, which can accentuate those social inequalities within regions. And if we think about spatial justice in a kind of following Henri Lefebvre's idea of the right to the city, which is one of the origins of the concept of spatial justice, you can think about this as a kind of right to the region, as another way of thinking of spatial justice. And from this point of view, we can argue that those migrants are obstructed from fully realising a right to the region by facing precarity and access in housing or work or public services, through exploitation of low levels of pay, through having limited political say, shaping those regions. So the participation of those life of those regions is to some degree constrained. And indeed, we might that constraint of right to space be quite literal in terms of restrictions on their mobility, on their residence, especially of refugees and asylum seekers. So that does lead to the question of how do we successfully integrate migrants in the region? And that successful integration and a net balance, therefore, whether the impact of migration from a region is negative or positive, are then agreed shaped by a range of factors, which are the same kind of factors which feed into our broader understanding of territorial inequality. So not only does territorial inequalities contribute to migration potentially amplifies certain aspects of territorial inequalities, but territorial inequalities also affect the capacity of regions to adapt to migration and to do that successfully. So again, a few of the recommendations we have in the policy brief document pull this together. So again, there is now, as part of the new programming period, reference to migration in the cohesion policy and the distribution of structural funds, but we recommend that actually built upon with more explicit development policy and programs to recognise the contribution of migration to addressing territorial inequalities, which might involve initiatives through the structural funds, but might also be about coordinated action in other policy areas in national programmes as well. And we also suggest that in thinking about territorial policy, there may well be a need for targeted support directed to localities experiencing either exceptionally high levels of immigration or severe and sustained depopulation, to try to mitigate those impacts and the knock-on effects on wider territorial inequalities. So again, that's a brief summary of some of our position, our work around migration. I'm going to hand over now to the panel. So Apostolos, Lewis, welcome, and Lucy, and then Bettina, who is also joining us online.
I'm delighted to coordinate this panel. I'd like to thank Mike for giving a very good summary of the discussions and the context for migration. And a lot of this stuff is mentioned in the policy brief. And I would like to say that there are some questions which have been circulated before for organizing this panel. So I will stick with this main themes and try to, in the end, to add a couple of themes more, which are very much related to those themes. I will go into it very fast. And I would like to say that migration, the whole discussion about migration as it is being and the research as it's being conducted, there's a quantitative aspect, a very strong quantitative aspect, having to do with perceptions. But the more localized work is related to qualitative work, which has been done intensively along the course of a couple of years, 3 years, in field work, which informed also and connected to the other work packages and work and the themes of the project. So as we saw from the discussion earlier, there are a lot of issues which come and relate to the issue of migration. So migration both is informed by the territorial inequality issues and also the cohesion as such. So I will not necessarily determine the sequence of the. Please feel free. I will try to relate the themes for discussion, and I will start from the first one, which has to do with what part do territorial inequalities play in shaping patterns of migration in Europe. And having said that, this has to do with the discussion on the objective and subjective or quantitative and qualitative findings or evidence which support this the reply to this question. So you want to Luis to start or to whomever, and then go to Bettina. Okay.
Oh, I don't have to. Great.
You don't need to.
How convenient. Let me say a few things about territorial inequalities and migration. So the first thing to note is that migration is spatially highly differentiated. We see that people born outside the EU are far more likely to live in southern or northwestern member states than in eastern member states. The current war invasion of Ukraine may change that temporarily, permanently. It's an open-ended question. But currently, people born outside the EU, much more likely to live in southern and northwestern EU, and in particularly in cities. They congregate there much more so than in towns, and much more so than in rural areas. They also tend to have lower employment rates, in particular the women. When it comes to people born in a different member state, they're smaller in number, they're more evenly distributed, less concentrated in cities than the people born outside the EU. And they are spread more evenly across the union. Some move for studies, some move for work, some move for retirement. And one of the key differences, of course, is that people with EU citizenship are protected, have the freedom of movement. And that obviously makes it much easier for them to move wherever their interests or their opportunities take them. Whereas if you're confined to a single country, it may be difficult to find the partner, the study, the degree, the job that you're looking for. So I think that freedom of movement is one of the reasons that actually people born in a different EU member state have a higher employment rate than the native born, right? It's this freedom that allows them to follow opportunities that means that they're better integrated. So for me, I think it's key to think about what are the constraints and what are the options for people. Now, when it comes to territorial inequalities, there are many. Working for cohesion policy, I study them intensively. Obviously, the type of jobs, what you earn, what kind of degree you need, all play a key role. And you do see that areas with low wages, high share of employment in agricultural sector tend to see more out migration. So there's definitely a factor there. But I think for people, for migrants and also for refugees, the response of the host community also plays a clear role. When we look at figures of is your area a good place to live for migrants, you know, a lot of people are fairly honest and they say, no, if I were a migrant, I wouldn't want to live in my neighborhood or my area. And so it's also the attitude of the host community in response to those arrivals that determines whether people want to stay or want to move there in the first place. And I would acknowledge, especially communities which are already under stress, under provision with services, suffering from austerity, are more likely to take a hostile approach to an additional population, putting further burdens on the schools and the healthcare in their community. But that's more an underlying flaw under provision and austerity than something that is caused by the refugees or the migrants. And so I think what the pandemic has really brought into focus is that we need to make sure that all communities have sufficient capacity to respond to a surge in healthcare demand, for example. So I think it is a complex aspect, but of course, working for the European Union that defends the freedom of movement, I think that's a very important aspect. Start there.
Okay.
Well, it's going to be very difficult to add much to that. I think it was a very comprehensive summary of the situation, and of course, even more difficult to disagree with that. So I try to not to repeat, but add still something to that. And of course, I come from a project that focuses very much on our third country nationals and their impact. I haven't paid that much attention to the internal dynamics in the European Union, but the distinction is clear, of course, because the rights are very, very different, and this needs to be acknowledged. The key thing that I see is really that migration in general tends to be very misrepresented and based on misconceptions. Quite often we approach migration in rather emotional terms, especially from outside the European Union, rather than concrete evidence. The evidence exists, there are facts, there are studies that show, for example, what is the economic, what is the social impact of whether then it's an internal migration within the European. We saw many good illustrations today what that is. There are studies that show the economic and social impact of external migration. I mean, external from the European Union, but that doesn't seem to matter too much, especially in these deprived regions that Louis referred to. And I come from one myself, so this what you were saying rings a bell quite a bit. I come from the eastern Finland, where the situation now is very interesting regarding what is going on the eastern side of the border. Maybe we can go to that later on, because the example there is exactly that this region, the eastern part of the Finland, which has been by far the most lagging region within Finland, and many of your maps as well that we were shown in the first session today, has actually benefited extensively from the Russian influence and migration from Russia. Labor migration to an extent, but especially family related migration, mixed marriages, such as that. And also more secondary seasonal, which cannot really be considered, cannot be considered as migration, because for the people, say from St. Petersburg, from Moscow, they bought their second homes in this part of the country, in Finland, contributing heavily on that region. We are talking about big bucks coming in, and this is going to be interesting to see what's going to happen to that now, because politics have changed rather drastically on that regard. So certainly migration plays a very key role. The second point, in addition to these misperceptions and misconceptions, is exactly the role of the host community. I don't like to talk about natives or using that kind of a category, but the whole society, whatever that is, because there has been instances indeed that we have a very deprived region or city or town or municipality that has received a sudden influx of migrants. For example, during the so-called refugee crisis, right? And that has caused very xenophobic reactions, even though at this very municipality or community, it is understood that we cannot survive without migrants. We are losing population. Our population is getting older. Our tax euros are going down. We need more people in here. When people come, they are not accepted. So exactly to the point that these ideas and understandings do not really match with the concrete action. And I think that is the key problem that prevents us from utilizing the potential that migration could have in territorial inequalities.
Thank you for pointing out. I think the two short discussions, two short presentations were very much fit one with the other. And I think the issue of, before giving floor to Bettina, just in 1 minute, I want to say that the issue of scale, the issue of scale is important to address the issue of inequalities and of perceiving how migration meets the issue of inequality and at what level.
Mm-hmm.
The higher the scale, the more difficult it is to find the solution, I think. The lower the scale, the easier to find the solution, but more difficult to involve the people and the different stakeholders. But I think it's important to mention that these are very well, I mean, these are good basis for the discussion. Bettina, I would like to hear your comments.
Thank you, Apostolos. I think everything which has been said is, of course, very valid. But I have always a problem with talking about migration because it makes a lot of difference what kind of migrants go for which reasons where and how that affects the situation. So generally, I think it's correct that people move to a better place, and why they consider a place better can depend on economic motives, can be motives of safety, can also be a motive is very often also freedom to live your own life in your own way, but towards a better quality of life, whatever the better quality of life is. So inequality encourages mobility because in a way I think it's better to talk about mobility, which also can be, of course, not wished for, but it also reproduces inequality. So it might help people to lead a better life individually, but it might reproduce inequality in the place where you're from because it leads to brain drain, to loss of population, to aging, to masculinization, because we see very many regions where women leave, and these women then individually gain power, are empowered. But of course that's good, but for the regions where they come from, it's a huge loss, and it prevents revitalization in a way. But it also might, and we have seen that time ago, many years ago in Ireland, that the people who want change, also political change, are pushed out or are leaving because they flee from danger. So in that sense, it also reproduces inequality in the place where you're from, because there then change doesn't happen and the people who stay behind are still under pressure. But it can also have very complex, so you might gain in population. So we see that, for instance, in some of the depopulating areas. So newcomers can come in, maybe from urban areas fleeing COVID. So you have more people, and that you could see that lowers the inequality or adds to the quality of life in the region for some people, but it might also result in an increase of housing prices, which in a way then is to the detriment of some of the residents which lived there before. So it can also in a way be, although it might be an economic gain for the region as a whole, it might lead to more inequality within a region. So it's not so easy the patterns are very complex and very often also not foreseen. And that makes it, of course, also very difficult to develop adequate policy measures. If I continue, then we go on into other questions, so I want not to do that.
Okay.
The sequence of questions.
Thank you, Bettina. I think the issue of complexity, and I'm glad that you brought in the discussion the issue of well-being, which informs or allows us to find connections between the scale, the spatial aspect, and the human agency aspect, which is important, I think, for connecting the dots and finding sense, finding interpretation. I think it's important. What I wanted also to point out is that we've got different levels and different configuration of scale, like regional, local, or sub-regional, which make it matter a lot when it comes down to deciding how migrants or patterns of migration match certain regions or have an impact or receive the impact of inequalities. So it's different, and we have the perceptions of the locals and of the movers at the same time. In this project, we included under migration all different kinds of movers, internal movers, international refugees, which made it more complex, much more complex. But the issue is there: how these territorial inequalities at different scales link to the patterns. And the second issue, I will just jump to the second issue, is how can migration act as an informal channel for redistribution within regions and reducing territorial inequalities, which has the assumption behind it, but that there are also formal ways, more formal channels. So this is not, these migration acts as a way to address economic issues which are not recognized by official policy itself. So migration plays one way or another a role in redistribution between regions and in addressing or alleviating, another way to say the same thing, territorial inequalities. So is that the case? Is it, in my understanding, is migration recognized as a domain for economic policy and regional policy? And does it play a role? Maybe it's becoming more and more complex, the discussion, but I think it's interesting to hear your thoughts.
Can I go?
Yeah, please, if you want. I try to add then something. We are creating a dynamic here.
You added a lot. I really appreciate what you brought to the table. And it's very pertinent, especially today. We're talking at a very high level of abstraction, and so it's good to unpick a few things, right? First of all, the sending communities don't necessarily lose. Sending communities actually gain. The amount of remittances people send back are massive. Within the EU, they're bigger than cohesion policy. And that's, for me, the biggest policy out there. That's more than 50 billion euros every year that gets sent back to communities that have sent somebody somewhere else. So they don't lose in that way. The people who stay, well, actually, unemployment rates may drop, wages may rise. So they don't also necessarily lose, right? I don't think you can equivocally say, if you're a sending community, you lose, and if you're a receiving community, you gain. It really depends on where you start from and why people leave and what they send back to see if that actually is the case. We did a study with the OECD looking at the impact of international migration, and we actually found positive impacts, both for the people who we don't want to call natives, let's call them the host community, but also for the migrants. I mean, people move to flee danger, flee a war, an invasion, or persecution or discrimination. So they're definitely trying to improve their lives, and typically they do so. But the recipient communities are not necessarily worse off either. So does migration reduce territorial inequalities? It can. Does it reproduce them? Sometimes it does. And here, to pick up the point of gender that Bettina made, we know, it's crystal clear in Europe. Rural regions lose women. They do. If you look at the age group 20-45, for each 100 women that age, you have 100 men in urban regions. You've got like 107 men in rural regions. Some of them are not going to be that happy. Some of them might vote for parties I disagree with, but I digress. When it comes to regional policy, what does cohesion policy do? Cohesion policy can do a lot. One of the things it clearly does with the ESF is help the labor market integration of the foreign-born, particularly the third country born. Also, it can help accommodate rapid influxes. We're now putting through a legislative package to ensure that cohesion policy can help with the refugee crisis because of the war in the Ukraine. So that's another way we can help. But what's very difficult for cohesion policy is to overcome decades of underinvestment. And if you get a situation where you have a deprived community which has been under-provisioned in terms of services, which has suffered austerity, and then sees an influx of people with a different religion, a different language, a different skin color, people they do not recognize as being part of their community, that can create a lot of friction. This is very difficult to resolve quickly. And what we've seen, if you look at the UK, for example, which communities voted more for Brexit? It wasn't the communities with the highest share of foreign-born. London voted to stay. It was the communities where the number of foreign-borns increased most. And typically they increased from a low level to a slightly high level, but that visible community came as a shock to the host community. And as a result, they mistakenly voted to leave the union, thinking that we controlled how many third country nationals entered the EU. But I digress again.
I think she might have a comment. She raised her hand.
Yeah. Bettina, I cannot see the screen.
Yeah.
It's behind me. Sorry, Bettina.
Yes, I know that raised my hand because I think so. We talk about informally, we know about remittances, but they are generally go to individuals, to families, and are rarely used as an investment. And I think that's a big loss. We have also seen in our research that there are communities where the mayor, that was in a Romanian village, takes up the initiative to use the knowledge, but also the networks and the money coming in from migrants to build up the community, to build up the resilience of the community, to make the community a place people would also like to come back to, and to share the wealth created with everybody. And I think that is something that in this case depended on a very clever mayor, but it could be done. So if we look, for instance, in the Netherlands, we are gaining a lot from Polish, Romanian labor migrants, which help us to sustain our economy, in particular in agriculture. And we pay individual migrants, also not always fairly, but I think while they invest in or help us to sustain our communities, we could in return also invest in their community. So there are measures thinkable where you have a more reciprocal way of dealing with the gain and loss in equality or inequality that migration brings about. there have been also formal channels, like it was also mentioned earlier, that you can settle refugees predominantly in rural areas or depopulating areas. Sweden does that. I think it's a very difficult policy because it's also, I understand the notion, and a lot of depopulating areas have the idea we need people, not the migrants, but maybe the refugees. They have very vague ideas of whom they would like to have. But I think it's not a way of instrumentalizing refugees, and generally the communities are also not prepared in terms of the services that people need. So I think we can do things, but that should be not exploitative in the sense instrumentalizing people to serve our, and I say our because we are generally the ones hosting them, but taking account of the interdependence in terms of whom we need and want to have, in particular as labor migrants, and what we could do in return to redistribute also wealth across Europe and among hosting and sending communities. We're not doing that, but I think it would be worthwhile considering. And Romania was a perfect example.
I think the complexity of migration, of course, is the key issue, because it really depends on who we are talking about. And this relates exactly to the gender issue, what was said, that in many of these regions, more women are moving out, men are left behind, and that actually explains this mixed marriages between Finland and Russia. Most of the Russian immigrants are women marrying Finnish men. And if you pay attention to the many of the refugees and asylum seekers that arrived, it's a very different story. Very different story. And actually, much of the debate in the media paid attention to the fact that why people had rather suspicious attitude towards them were exactly because they were seemingly young men and not matching that kind of image that many people had from those that really need our help, right? And the gender aspect was brought into that discussion quite often, at least in Finland. But to answer your question, which was that is migration really recognized as a way to tackle regional disparities? I would say yes, it has been recognized. There's a lot of rhetoric around this. I mean, we make and repeat the statement that we can utilize migration to counterbalance the depopulation tendencies, which are very prevalent in many of these regions. I hear that all the time. So yes, it has been recognized. But how do we actually translate this into practice? This is the issue, and whether we actually have a commitment to do that. In my reading, this is quite often a very trendy rhetoric that is something that a policymaker needs to say, but then the actions do not really follow. And this might be, to an extent, based on this lack of investment that has been there for years. Only now, recently, we have realized that it is a serious matter, and we need to act on that. But we lack the concrete means to really do that. And this relates to the point that Bettina made on exploitation. That remains a very key issue, because it's still the certain individuals of the whole society who make the decisions on who can do what, who is wanted for what purpose, and we also tend to make these limits that prevent certain individuals from raising their status within the society, their social mobility, even though they might be very much what that community is needed. The pandemic situation has been a very good example and I'm sorry if I'm referring so much to my own case, but that's the case that I know, where are lacking a lot of doctors, medical personnel, for example, which has been very, very, very obvious during the pandemic. At the same time, we've had in-migration outside the European Union with many doctors, very high-skilled people, but we don't recognize their skills officially. and we tend to direct, and I use we here in a completely wrong sense, but you get the point. People with tremendous skills are directed to very exploitive works, sometimes, which of course doesn't really help them to reach the actual goals why they have been moving. Of course, refugees, they are forced to move, but then others are moving because of lifestyle, better working conditions, higher salaries. We all know this, but we don't allow them to utilize that, and thus maintaining this binary distinction between the host society and the migrant, right? Keeping the migrant as migrant. Right?
I'm glad that we recognize this dissonance, this divergence between rhetoric and reality, policy, reality
Right.
policy. But Luis wants to say something about it.
Yeah, I wanted to commend it because something Bettina said kind of sparked me in the sense that, you talked about the right to the city, Henri Lefebvre. You can also turn it around, and I think, a region or a community doesn't have a right to migrants, nor does it have a right to women. They're not entitled to keep their own women, right? And so policies that smack of pushing people to places where they don't want to go and where the host community doesn't want to welcome them doesn't strike me as a policy that's going to contribute to a net positive gain in welfare, right? Everybody involved doesn't like it. So why do we think this is a good idea? And the other thing I emphasize in all my talks about demography is in a lot of regions, population is shrinking. A lot of member states, population is shrinking. In the EU, population soon will be shrinking. As a result, most of us will be living in a shrinking region in the future. Already 1/3 of the people live in a shrinking region. And because it's a shrinking pie, stopping one region from shrinking inevitably means another region starts shrinking, right? So the blunt message is get used to it, people. It's not gonna go away. We can't fix this. And the reason we shrink is because we have an aging baby boom. The younger age cohorts are much smaller than the age cohort in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so inevitably we're going to reduce. And so if a politician comes to me like, my region is shrinking, I'm not shocked. I'm not even worried. It really depends if it's a dramatic reduction. Depopulation, I acknowledge, creates strains. You need to readjust, your services, your infrastructure, your housing market may not function very well. You may need to select which settlements you want to strengthen and which ones you want to help move people out of. Those are difficult decisions that cost money. But a little small reduction in your population is not a nightmare, and it's not an injustice, right? It's not because you have a few fewer people there that you're worse off. You might have less congested roads, might be more quiet, you might be easier to get a table at a bloody restaurant. I mean, there's lots of benefits. So for me, the key metric is not how many people live in a region. The key metric is, do they live well? And then the second question is, how is the population composition and numbers changing, and how is that affecting the welfare? And only if it does affect the welfare is there a question to intervene. So, for me, the proposal there on the slide of like directing forcing migrants to go live in depopulating regions, I'm not really sure that this is something I would promote. I'm definitely sure the EU will never promote such a thing. I digress.
Yes. I think you've responded to the third question.
Well, then I'll pass the floor to
You're thinking ahead, probably. And that's, of course, I think this boils down to the issue of how out-migration can be faced, can be confronted, whether there's a way to confront out-migration. And this is of course, it's a key issue all the time. And I'm glad that you brought again the issue of well-being. It's every time we return back to this issue, whether people are happy or glad to be there, both the locals, not the indigenous, the locals, including those who came in different groups as the time has passed, and those the newcomers, just using different language to be descriptive. There are again the issues, and this time I will start with Bettina. The other way around, Bettina. Do regions? The question is: do regions with high levels of in-migration face particular challenges for local development or social cohesion? And the second sub-question is: how might this be addressed? But the main question is the first, I think. The main question is the first one.
Yeah, that depends, of course, a lot on who is coming. So it's, again, very difficult to answer the question in such a general way. If I look back on the research that we have done, then it was clear that some of the regions were some of the people in the regions where a lot of labor migrants would arrive had lots of fears and lots of concerns. Some were ungrounded in the sense of loss of employment, because generally labor migrants who come in do the work nobody else wants to do. So it's not a loss of employment, but still, I think what is behind that is fear of losing home. And that is also true for newcomers coming from urban areas. So the idea of losing your own home because people who come in might change it, might bring other norms and values, might buy your nice houses, might dominate the council. So it depends again on, are these newcomers from city regions, metropolitan regions, or do we talk about labor migrants? I think in general, so lots of these fears are ungrounded. Some of the fears are because urban newcomers may buy the nicest houses or may result in a rise of house prices. When we talk about labor migrants, it was also very clear that people avoided to encounter them. So in terms of where to house them, in the Netherlands, clearly the preference was to have them outside of the village, not as neighbors, as far away as possible, which in a way reproduced all the fears, because the people, it's of course normal people, but if you don't see them and if they have no access to normal services, they would, for instance, drink in the garden because there was no pub to go to. But again, see the people drink in the garden. So what I think is the most important thing to overcome or to address these challenges, and many of the challenges that are ungrounded, is to invest in encounters and in interaction. Mm-hmm. When it comes to real changes in the sense on local services, or no availability of local services, it's important, of course, if you want people to host newcomers, and that's certainly true for refugees, but again, so different groups, make sure that they are well equipped, and that their services are not overloaded, because you cannot, the fear of losing what you have is grounded or ungrounded, perceived or experienced, is the most important reason for areas to be hesitant to host them, and is one of the biggest challenges, I think. To invest in the resilience of areas, there for what concerns the material infrastructure, and make sure that people meet each other to see that they are just as normal as everybody is.
Okay. I think it's Bettina gave us another angle to from the perspective of those who receive the others. It's again being descriptive, and this issue of what is local development in the eyes of the different groups that they participate, that take part in the economy in regional level and the local level, and since it's mentioned local development and social cohesion, so there is a kind of less implicit assumption that social cohesion is an enabler for local development to some extent. So you need some kind of social cohesion in order to achieve local development by and large. So these are connected somehow. That's how they presented in the question. So what would you say on that? We speak about those regions where in-migration have higher levels of in-migration, who are receivers of migrants, and what challenges they face.
May I?
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a very good question, and I sense that here it's, as always, very difficult to generalize, and we need to assume rather place-based approach to this. And what I mean by that is that I see a major difference here between regions that have been traditionally been very homogeneous, where the social cohesion has been defined in a rather strict and narrow sense, right? The kind of invisible social glue that it is assumed to hold us together tends to be very, very strong, and this relates to the comment that Bettina made, that it depends on who's coming, right? How is the person coming considered as threatening, in the sense that it is challenging how us is being defined, right? And we see a major difference between the circumstances of 2015-16 and, for example, now when people are fleeing out of Ukraine. Reaction is completely different, completely different. Even in cases, in countries, regions, and localities that have been very anti-migration for a long time. Now the rules have changed automatically somehow, and I think this is something that to answer your question, there's a normative angle quite often. Even in our policies, in many of our policies, we have a normative angle, which basically tells you that if you want to be welcomed, you need to integrate into who we are and what we do, our system, our political structure, and how our society is being defined. And I understand that to an extent as a political tool, but then if you really start to think about the impact of migration, which is the impact is usually the aspect that holds the potential to change people's attitude. If I personally perceive that these newcomers are bringing in a positive impact to the society, whether it's a social impact, cultural impact, economic impact, I tend to be more open-minded and supportive of that. To me, we are often rather fixated on the integration criteria, that before you can have an impact, you need to integrate, right? You need to become one of us, and then we can consider you as an equal part of the society, and then you can start thinking about your impact. And I think we need to change this thinking a little bit. There are a lot of people, a lot of migrants who bring in a major economic impact to some of these regions that can be very much not integrated at all. But we usually leave them outside of the thematic when we are talking about. We don't talk about the university professors or company CEOs who fly in from various countries and bring in a major impact of the society. When we talk about third country nationals coming in, we usually talk about refugees, asylum seekers, people who are quite often in public and to an extent political rhetoric considered as a burden, as something that we need to manage and help
And of course, if you frame something as a burden, it then becomes a burden, right? And I think really we need to highlight the positive impacts of migration, whether it's then labor migration, family migration, whatever that is. These are usually hidden, and we focus on the negative aspects of migration. And I think that holds down the potential to have a positive impact.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make, and I'd like to add something which came to my mind when you added to what Bettina said. I think it's important who is coming, and to add the temporal aspect, when is coming. And I have in mind in having lived in Greece and having this experience from the migration crisis, refugee crisis of that time, which in the end was much smaller in terms of numbers in specific time period compared to the Ukrainian crisis, again, crisis in inverted commas. Now we could speak for crisis with a lot of, very emphatically. So at that time, people who put into Greece and went to the rest of Europe, they came to move further to the rest of Europe, so they didn't actually come, they just passed through. But also when it's coming is important. I mean, at what specific period, because Greece at that time was in the middle of crisis, economic crisis, still, which lasted for many years. So there is the issue of the other aspects of when and how and who is coming, to add, to make it more bold. But there is a lot of question marks there, and it's not an easy answer to the issue whether the people who are coming are received happily or not happily, or burden or necessary burden. On the other hand, Luis, you want to share with us some thoughts?
Sure. It is important who is coming and when they come. It's also important why they come. If they come to marry a local, maybe it's different. If they come to escape an invasion by Russia, it might be different. If they flee civil war, again, it might be different. I'm going to agree that when you see the word migrants in the press, they usually don't refer to what people call expats, right? They don't refer to the affluent. They don't refer to the whites. They typically refer to the poor and the brown. So it's often a euphemism for something that starts to look like discrimination. So it's difficult. But there is a double-edged sword there. Some cities in Europe have become either majority foreign-born or majority first and second generation immigrants. I think Brussels is already close to 50%, or if above 50% foreign-born. To give you an example, I was at a parents' meeting at the school of my kids, and the mom hosting the group looked around and was like, oh, God, I'm the only parent here who raises my kids in one language. Because all the other couples, including my couple, raises their kids bilingual because they're not from the same country or the same language group. So there is a certain community of living in a region where lots of people have a diverse background. There's also a certain community of being able to live close to people who do speak your native tongue, or cook your native cuisine, or believe in your particular brand of religion, that they would lose if they weren't able to concentrate. But also legitimately, some communities want to keep, say, the cultural homogeneity of their community high. And I struggle with that. Is that a legitimate concern? I don't know, maybe. But let me close with this. I'm a political scientist by training, and there's a very famous little book, which I encourage you to read, by Albert Hirschman. It's called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. Many of you will know it, but it's not specifically applied to international migration, but I feel like it can tell us a story. Because what are migrants doing? They're voting with their feet. They're picking exit, right? They're leaving their community. And often they're criticized for doing so, because the criticism is you should have remained loyal to your community. But there's a third option, and which is voice. And I liked what Bettina said, because you can give voice both to the host community and to the newcomers. And I think when you give voice to people, it makes them feel heard. It gives their concerns a way of airing. And sometimes by just talking about the concerns, they shrink, or they're seen in a fresh light, and they realize that they can be resolved, or maybe that the differences aren't so fundamental. So I think it is important that people are seen and heard, and this is true for both the hosts and the newcomers, and they shouldn't be locked away somewhere far away from the rest, because then you don't get to see each other and you don't get to speak. So maybe, maybe voice can help in regions which receive quite a few immigrants to allow both communities to get to know each other and to coexist more happily.
That's an optimistic. It's an optimism coming out. I think it's to finish the session, and I think it's good to invite questions from the. Have 5 minutes if I gather?
Yeah, 5 minutes. So we can go slightly up, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, if there are questions from those who attend the event, if Patrick has something.
Not from the chat, but I actually have a question myself. So I was wondering, because we have had this very abstract conversation about what should be done to accommodate migrants in one way or the other, and the relationship between groups. But I was a bit struggling that there was no agency in many of the statements. I was wondering, who should actually, and I guess whoever has an answer to this, who should actually be the actors who should welcome migrants, or should they, or which agency do migrants have, and how should they interact? And who are we looking here? Is it the civil society, is it political parties, and because this is essentially where a lot of the tension comes from, and how can these tensions, I guess, be resolved? Because I guess when we stay at this abstract level, it obscures a lot of what actually needs to be done on the ground. So just if anyone wants to balance that. I guess not an easy answer, but a answer.
You see what we've done. You turn the discussion now to political science discussion. With your comment, which is interesting. It always comes down to politics. I mean, to how people participate. And the issue of agency in the literature, it's very clear that migrants have agency.
They move.
They are agents. But the thing is how they can express their agency. That's what I understand from what Patrick said, or how they are. Which are the agency-related factors that allow for their participation? I would add for those who are legally present, and those for those who are irregularly present, because there are different rules for them.
Given it's my fault we get this question, I'll take a first attempt at answering it. I think there's a multitude of actors who need to step up to the plate. For me, the political already is an agent in this, either by condemning the moves or welcoming them or ignoring them. And I think they need to find a better way of engaging them. I think definitely the public sector will already be in some way interacting with them. Either to find housing or services or training or employment. I do feel that they could do a better job of communicating about that and not necessarily just focusing on the burdens, but also the benefits. Definitely civil society, media have a role to play. But I would add to that, I think it's also important to facilitate migrants or newcomers to get organized, to create an association, to find a place where they can meet each other, and also where they can communicate to the wider community, not just as an individual, but also member of a larger group. And so in that sense, if we can help newcomers to organize or to create their own civil society organizations, or join some of the local civil society organizations, I think that could also be very beneficial. And then lastly, I think for cohesion policy, I think it's very important that we understand what the needs are and how those needs are changing and how those can be reflected in programs.
Okay, thank you. I think Bettina has something to say. She raised her hand. No?
Yeah, I had several things came up my mind. I think I'm very curious how it will work now, and that sounds maybe a bit harsh, how it will work out with Ukraine immigrants who are received in a totally different manner. They are allowed to find jobs, so they are treated as normal people, whereas a lot of other labor migrants in third countries, we try to make it as impossible as possible to integrate. I think the most important is whether or not, so people, there are these kind of organizations. So for instance, Polish labor migrants have their own civil society organizations, but they are never invited to talk outside of their stakeholders or direct stakeholders. I think what is also very important is if you want to, you engage where you feel at home. You do not engage where you are tolerated at best and not welcomed, or people want to send you away at worst. I once read a very interesting, or it was a very small notification in their newspaper, but it really touched me. So in the Netherlands, we have these feast for the queen or the king, these orange parties they are called, and they're very local, and they are a lot in villages, and they include a lot of activities for children. So it's really a very merry, traditional kind of party. In this particular village, they had difficulty to find people to help, and they never, and Polish labor migrants offered help. They very much enjoyed to help, to make it a nice party for the children. They had maybe not royal parties, but similar traditional parties as well. And nobody had ever considered to turn to them to ask for help, whereas they love to do it. And that is the way how you feel at home, to be invited to participate, not necessarily on the level of organizations, not even necessarily in local politics, because a lot of people who come in also don't want to settle down, but they want to have an enjoyable, they want to be at least temporarily at home and welcomed and participate. So I think in very often, that for me made very clear, it's also very small things that matter. But which do not require a lot of organization. Of course, things have to happen at the political level, but my idea of politics is actually at the moment they try to avoid any problems and don't really try to do anything. Just look away when it comes to migration because they fear the populist parties. And so my expectation is more towards the local societies and normal people and make people welcome there. Not forever, maybe, but for the time being, that is already a huge step, I think. And then you have these normal encounters, and that support social integration, in my view.
Thank you, Bettina. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Lucy.